Welcome back to the Locker Room Chat, segment number two, talking about Ron Medved and his years on the football field and as well as beyond. So we're going to go a little bit beyond the glory here in segment two. Ron, so here you are. You're in your late 20s, and as I say, the glory years are over. Lots of bright lights, high profile life you're living in, bright spotlights. Now the rest of your life here is before you. Okay, talk to us a little bit about that transition. Were there some things that you had to come down from and get settled in your life? Did you have a clear idea of what was next? You talk about how you were already into psychology. Sounds like you were prepared for what was next in your life, but talk to us a little bit about that, maybe your family life, and then we'll get into your social entrepreneurship.
Yeah, Jay. Well, it's a tough transition, and I think for anybody to go from being a professional athlete to being whatever it is you're going to do for the rest of your life. I mean, there's a shift there, that has to be made, and it just isn't easy. You're right. I retired from football. I was 27 years old, and uh, and I moved from Philadelphia back to Seattle, and I had a few ideas about what I wanted to do next, but I didn't have this psychology thing really crystallized in my mind, in the beginning. I uh, I came back to Seattle, and while I was while I was in Philadelphia, this is again back in the day when I played. You know, many of us had to have second jobs. We
Yeah.
we didn't make enough money to really carry us all the way through the year. So what I did in my off season was I was trained as a New York Stock Exchange
Mhm.
stockbroker. And so I thought that finance or financial planning was going that might be what I wanted to do. Now, I ended up uh, doing that for a number of years, both while I was playing and then after. Uh, but as a matter of fact, uh, the other aspect is, when I finished playing, uh, I was pretty sure I didn't want to coach. Uh, and the reason why I didn't want to coach is because that would have been too much of a no-brainer for me. I mean, I could
Yeah.
have gone into coaching. I could have sold sporting goods equipment.
Yeah.
I
Sure.
could have done something that was related,
Yeah.
to the sport that I came out of. But I I I wanted to do something different. And I go back to my Bellarmine days, and the mission statement of Bellarmine High School in those days and to this day, as far as I know, was the mission was to become an educated man and to then go in the world and and do good.
Yeah.
Okay. And to me, I was a product of a product of my times. I mean, I was a 20 something person in the late 60s, and there's a lot of social unrest. There was a lot of
Oh,
social causes,
uh,
then that uh, that we all cared deeply about. And so I wanted to do something that was socially significant. Uh, and the whole term of social entrepreneur uh, really relates to the fact is I wanted to go into business. I didn't want to work in government necessarily. I didn't want to work in education. I wanted to be in business. I had some business background, but I wanted to be in a business that had social impact. That was sort of my standard for looking for what I wanted to do. Then I also had this interest in psychology, which I had nurtured, as a player. And I felt that a big part of my game was the mental game as well as the physical game. And so that kind of melded together. And I ended up, becoming introduced to Lou Tice, who at that time was the chairman and chief teacher at the Pacific Institute in Seattle. Now, I knew of Lou by reputation. I mean, he was a former football coach. Some of my
Community.
good friends knew him and respected him. Rick Redmond, for example, was one of my best friends, and
Mm-hmm.
Rick was played for Lou when Lou was a coach, and I ended up uh, going to one of Lou's seminars where Lou was teaching psychology, and Lou was a very good teacher. And it took me, a couple years to sort of sort my things out in a way where I could actually join his organization. But I joined his organization not as an employee, but as a contractor. And again, I was in business for myself. I had my own company, but I was closely affiliated with the Pacific Institute and Lou's work. And I ended up for starting a career where I was not a teacher as much as I was a project manager for uh, organizations and corporations that use the Pacific Institute's education. So I was kind of the project manager, and I also had responsibility for doing marketing. I needed to go out and find organizations that may have a need for what the Pacific Institute was offering. So that ended up being my career uh, at the Pacific Institute, and we can come back and fill in the blanks. But I ended up working with the Pacific Institute for 40 years, and I feel very fortunate, to have found something that fit me and that kept my interest for all those years. Most of those 40 years, I was a project manager and brought hundreds of projects to the Pacific Institute. 7 of those years, I was a vice president of the corporation. This is later in the 40 years where, uh, I was helping manage the organization. And then my last few years, and I retired a couple years ago, but my last few years I spent mainly teaching. So but all of that 40 years, ended up being uh, full of sort of experiences that allowed me to have a social impact. I mean, I worked in the aerospace industry, helping aerospace companies uh, modernize themselves, especially in their relationship with their employees. I had some significant uh, experiences with NASA, uh, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and we can talk about that possibly. I I I did quite a bit of work with the military over those years as the military was coming out of Vietnam and sort of the 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 issues that they carried forward, all volunteer army as opposed to like a,
Yeah.
a draft,
Yep.
helped military leaders to sort of reinvent themselves and especially for peacetime. And I worked with a few sports teams. Got a chance to work with, excuse me, Pete Carroll. Got a chance to work with Nick Saban down in Alabama, just as he was starting his run there, back in 07, 08, and had a chance to work one season with Dennis Erickson. Uh, and and uh, and
So,
and
so Ron, let me ask you a quick question there, okay? Because for most of us, you say you work with those three people, highly successful, Coach Carroll, Coach Saban, and Coach Erickson. When you say work with them, what are you talking about? Are you talking about taking your philosophy, your psychology, your social entrepreneurship into their world and how it relates to football, to them as an individual? What does working with those coaches mean?
well, it meant something a little different for each one of them. But Nick Saban, for example, uh, invited us in because he'd heard about us from Pete Carroll, and I'll talk about
Okay.
Pete Carroll in a minute. But what Nick Saban wanted is that he was new at Alabama, and he didn't get off to an especially fast start. And one of his issues that he had was that he's recruiting all of these five-star athletes,
Yep.
but a lot of them were wonderful athletes, but many of them were not very mature. They were sort of immature. They come in with uh, you know what's the word I want to use? Uh,
I don't know, naivety.
favored,
Yeah,
favored,
sure.
spoiled athletes, I
Yeah,
mean, for lack of a better term.
yeah,
And one of the things that the psychology, the education could do was, help these players grow up faster,
yeah,
mature.
sure.
And so what the first thing that we did, I was the sort of the project manager for that Alabama account for maybe the first 5 years. I had we had education that was designed for the age group that a lot of those
Mhm,
players were in,
mhm.
for young adults. And so we brought in videotape seminars that those players went through to sort of give them some extra tools, psychological tools, in order to sort of be more accountable and be grown men as opposed to naughty boys, for lack of a better term.
Yeah,
And I had a couple of guys at the institute, fortunately, that were former players, that did the teaching, that did the
mhm,
facilitating. I didn't do it, but I sort of organized the project. I, I answered to Coach Saban. I was the sort of the liaison of the Pacific Institute to Coach Saban, and those guys were Nesby Glasgow, who was a
yeah,
great
sure.
UW player
Yeah,
and pro player, and Antoine Richardson, another. Both of them had pro experience,
mhm,
but both of them knew the Pacific Institute education.
yeah,
So I was the project manager for that,
yeah.
and so it was successful because
You
we
think?
yeah, well, I mean, we had a part of that success, and I'll just say, like, let's see, who's the Heisman Trophy winner from Alabama? Ingram, Mark Ingram,
Yeah,
went through our program, and he liked it well so much that we ended up training him to be a teacher. We trained him to be able to sort of facilitate the concepts that the Pacific Institute brought. Mark ended up being the Heisman Trophy winner one of those years back then, but the sort of the epitome of the program was we actually had players teaching players,
yeah,
at Alabama. And uh, anyway, you know, we're we're remembered fondly, by Coach Saban, I'm sure.
you are.
Yeah, because we played a role though, and the interesting thing about Saban is that Saban, he has a psychology background. That's what he studied in college, interestingly. So he had an openness, to this kind of approach.
Sure.
And same with Pete Carroll. And so, I mean, we knew Pete Carroll when he was with the Jets, believe it or not.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
all the way back, and the
yeah.
Patriots. And
Uh,
when Pete took kind of his year sabbatical in between the Patriots and USC, I mean, we were working with him, on his, you know, his own psychology, so to speak. And then, Pete got so good at, you know, what we would teach. I mean, he he uh, he ended up doing it himself, and Lou Tice ended up having a sort of a mentor relationship with Pete, and that lasted for many years. Right up until Lou Tice's passing in 2012. So
yeah.
um, Dennis Erickson,
Little
he
different guy than the first two you talked about.
well, yeah, it's interesting. Dennis Erickson, my youngest brothers, Jim and Jerry, they're twins. They actually played for
Oh,
Dennis at Idaho when
Idaho, sure.
was at Idaho. So,
Yeah.
but when I got a chance to sort of meet Dennis for the first time, and this is before he went down to Miami and had a lot of his success down there. He told me, he said, when I was at the UW and I was playing, I was his favorite player.
Hmm.
He was at Everett. He was a high school
Yeah.
player at Everett, and I never let him forget that. Yeah, I always would rib him whenever I see him. I remind him that I'm his favorite player. But with Dennis, our paths crossed when he was at Arizona State, I think. Yeah,
Yeah.
Arizona State. He was
Yeah.
coaching down there,
Yep.
and he decided that he knew of the Pacific Institute, and then I got to be the project manager for when he was down there for a couple of years, and so yeah, there were other coaches and other sports and that I had exposed to. But again, back to my career, I was in business, I was in military, I was in athletics, and I spent a lot of time you know helping people in the real estate industry as well. So uh, that ended up being there was a lot of social good that got done as a result of that work, and that that pleased me no end.
You bet you, Ron. Let me try to wrap this up just a little bit. I'm looking at your background there and I see all those books. Picture, I believe, is probably President Kennedy, maybe his brother Robert Kennedy. You talked about Bellarmine Prep and the mission there. Uh, your mission in life and maybe how that ties in, I think, with Pacific Institute, the mission that they had. Can you kind of wrap this up a little bit here, putting all that together? Again, Bellarmine Prep, their mission, the late '60s, what went on, uh, psychology in college, the Pacific Institute, social entrepreneurship. I know that's the question I'm asking, but a mission here or a statement or something that kind of puts that together for us here as we get ready to wrap up this wonderful afternoon of the locker room chat with you.
Well, thank you. I mean, uh, like I said, I've been retired here for a couple of years, and I've had time to think about the answer to your question. Like
Yeah.
how does this life all sort of wrap up into
Mhm.
make sense? And I'm pleased that it makes sense. I sort of it wasn't easy to make these transitions. I think that's maybe lesson number one, is that if you make a big transition from one career to the next, or one project to the next, I mean it looks daunting, but if you can master the psychology of transition for example, you're going to be really happy with yourself. And so uh, I'm pleased about the choices that I made. And but they weren't easy. I mean, it's easy to look back in retrospect and tell a story, but that doesn't really reflect the work that went into
Yeah.
that. And a lot of times the work is just you've got to fight through your own uncertainty, sometimes career wise. Uh, that was definitely true for me. But I feel very satisfied. I think just want to sort of mention my family. Uh,
Absolutely.
uh, you know, I've been married twice. Uh, I had two children from my first marriage, my son Sean and my daughter Erin. Uh, I I couldn't be prouder of them. My son Sean went to Evergreen State University and then went on to play 10 years of professional soccer in the new Major League Soccer league, and ended up winning a championship with
Mm,
DC United. But then he went on beyond that to become a pretty excellent coach, soccer coach, and he coached girls, uh, teenage girls, and won a national championship there. The girls, my two granddaughters, with Sean, they went on to play college soccer at Loyola Marymount in Los Angeles, and
good.
so Sean and his kids and he and his wife Janae, they live in Santa Cruz, California, and they've they, they've they've been successful at pursuing their dreams. My daughter Erin, she was a soccer player in high school, uh, and had the bad luck of having ankle injury and
Oh,
knee
yeah.
injuries. But she went on to play. She went on and tried to play at University of California at Santa Barbara. Uh, did not have a good experience there, but she stuck it out. She ended up transferring to the University of Washington and ended up playing the University of Washington women's team's first year as a varsity sport. She lettered and but then went on to this is Erin now. She is now uh, after 35 years at Costco. She's a vice president at
Mm,
Costco. Very successful career at Costco, and she's getting ready to retire herself. And so those guys are doing great, and I am now married. I've been married 35 years to Callie, and she is just sort of a blessing from heaven. Sometimes it's beyond psychology, Jay,
yeah.
but we're a match made in heaven. I'm so lucky to have her, and she's recently retired herself, and she's also a practicing artist. So what goes on around the household here these days is her art making, and our uh, doing our best to sort of live a quiet, retiring life. And knock on woods, so far so good.
Amen. Well, Ron, just thanks so much for chatting with us today on the locker room chat here as part of the Tacoma Pierce County Sports Museum. And I guess from all of us here in the Great Northwest, thanks so much for all the thrills you brought to us when going back to Bellarmine and University of Washington, Philadelphia Eagles. And then even more importantly, just for all the work you have done with your social entrepreneurship after those days, working with athletics and athletes across the country, and just being a great part of our Tacoma Pierce County history here. And as you said, taking what's been given to you, what you've learned, and then going out and making sure that that also works and helps others and doing good in our community. And you certainly have done that. So thank you so very, very much. That concludes today's presentation, the locker room chat. Once again, thank you to Rainier Asphalt and Concrete for their sponsorship. Again, I'm Jay Strickers, and we thank all of you for joining us on this edition of the Locker Room Chat, highlighting the life and times of Tacoma's own Ron Medved.